Okay, I have approximately 2:01 on my clock. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the EPA Grants Financial Management webinar that we're hosting today. I am going to turn things over real quick before we get started to Julie to discuss some basic housekeeping stuff.
Great, thank you so much, Ryan. Before we get started, let's review a few housekeeping tips. Your first tip is to maximize your browser window to make sure that you can see all of the controls. This is especially important if you want to use the closed caption feature. Your audio is controlled by the device you are using to join this webinar. So it could be your cell phone, it could be your desktop computer, or your tablet. There's no call-in number for this webinar, so if you want to use your smartphone, you need to use the link and open it up in your browser on your phone. If you are experiencing trouble with the sound or audio, turn up the volume of the device you are using, make sure it's not muted, and lastly, if that does not work, make sure that your broadcast is not paused. Click on the space bar or anywhere on the screen to unpause it. We are using the Microsoft Teams live event platform, so this is sort of like a TV broadcast. You'll be able to hear us and see the presentation, but we can't see or hear you. If you'd like to engage with us, you can send in questions by using the Q&A panel located on the top right side of your window. You can click Ask a Question, and that will direct your question to the moderators. This webinar will be conducted in English, and closed captions are available in Arabic, Chinese, English, Filipino, Spanish, and Vietnamese. If you'd like to use these features, on the bottom right corner of your window, click on the CC button to turn on live captions. Use the tool button right next to the CC button to select the language. And just a quick note, these are live captions, so they're not always accurate. They're being generated in real time as the speakers are talking, so some mistakes are anticipated. And lastly, a recording of today's webinar will be made available on the EPA Financial Management webinar webpage. And back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Julie. So first, I'd like to go over our agenda for today. We're going to be discussing ASAP overview and enrollment. We're going to be discussing drawing funds, book entry adjustments, FFR closeouts, and also returning funds. First, ASAP overview and enrollment process. ASAP stands for the Automated Standard Application for Payments. It's a U.S. Treasury system, and it's used by many federal agencies, to include the EPA, DOJ, etc. One of the nice features of ASAP is same-day, one-day payment, and it also includes reporting features for recipients to use. ASAP is a paperless system. This is just a diagram to show you kind of an overview of how ASAP works. Federal agencies use ASAP and grant recipients use ASAP also. So even though we're the EPA, we don't actually have any control over ASAP because we are just a federal agency using the system. Now, some of the responsibilities. Federal agencies are in charge of initiating enrollment for new recipients. Federal agencies are also in charge of creating grants for new recipients in the ASAP system. Federal agency increases and decreases the funds, and federal agencies also change administrative information, including end dates for grants. Federal agencies are also in charge of closing the grants in the ASAP system. As far as ASAP's responsibilities, ASAP completes the enrollments that the federal agencies initiate. ASAP also issues user IDs and passwords to recipients. ASAP is in charge of resetting passwords for their system. ASAP can also add and delete users in their system. And ASAP also provides users with walkthroughs on how to conduct draws, how to do book entry adjustments, and other training. Now, as far as enrolling recipients into ASAP, as the EPA is a federal agency, we are in charge of initiating the enrollment into ASAP. After the grant is awarded, EPA will email new recipients to complete the enrollment form. Recipients are required to return the form to rtpfc-grants@epa.gov. EPA, being the enrollment initiator, enrolls recipients online at asap.gov. This right here is kind of a larger view of the ASAP enrollment form. On the form, you can see that the recipient is in charge of filling out the organization's name, what type of organization, their UEI code, their EIN code. Both of that information can be, the recipient can get through sam.gov, and also the point of contact. They also have to include the contact's address, contact's email, contact's phone number, and it helps if you let us know if you have an existing ASAP account and what your organization's existing ASAP ID is. This is kind of a blown up view, so that way if you couldn't see in the last slide the details of the form, at the top you can see the recipient's name, the organization type, the UEI, and the EIN. And this is the second half of the form, the point of contact, contact's address, contact's email, contact's phone number, whether or not they have an existing ASAP account, and if yes, what that existing ASAP ID is. Now, as far as enrolling recipients go, after the EPA reaches out and gets in touch with the recipient, and after the recipient emails their enrollment form back to the EPA, ASAP will then communicate with the recipient via email. So it's very important that whatever email address you put on your enrollment form, you double check it to make sure it's correct, because that is how ASAP will be reaching out to you. There are 6 steps to complete the enrollment process. Each step must be completed prior to starting the next step. Recipients have 45 days to complete each step, or their enrollment is canceled and they have to be re-enrolled. This is a flowchart showing the enrollment process. EPA initiates the recipient organization enrollment. Point of contact, names of the organization and the officials. After that information is put into the system, the next step is for the head of the organization to approve those officials. Then the authorizing official has to define what the rules are for each of the recipient profiles. The authorizing official then defines the recipient organizational users, and then finally, the financial official defines the banking information. After the initial step of the EPA initiating the enrollment process, once the EPA initiates that, ASAP will then reach out to the recipient, and the recipient is in charge of completing the point of contact and the following steps after that. After the financial official defines the banking information, ASAP then sends the EPA an email confirming enrollment. EPA creates the grant account in ASAP and authorizes the funds. After enrollment is complete, it takes 7 to 10 business days for ASAP to verify the bank data. So it's very important when you receive notification that you've received your award, and when we reach out to you, it's very important that you send that enrollment form back to us. That way we can get this process going as quickly as possible. And it's also important as the recipient organization that you complete the steps in order and you do it as quickly as possible, because sometimes it does take a while for ASAP to verify that banking data. Next up, we are going to have Charlene talk to us about drawing funds. Charlene?
Thank you, Ryan. Before we continue with drawing funds, I'd like to start with a quick introduction of myself. My name is Charlene Johnson, and I work with the Research Triangle Park in the Finance Center in Durham, North Carolina. Additionally, you're going to have with us today, in addition to Ryan, we have Peter Puglisi, who is our team lead that will be introducing the federal financial reports, and then Cassandra Green, who works in our accounts receivable department. So now that Ryan has discussed the enrollment process, the question that you're all probably more interested in is how to draw the funds. Next slide. As Ryan previously addressed, all applicants are required to enroll in ASAP. For those of you interested in that policy, it can be found in the Recipient Applicant Information Notice, which is RAIN 2018-G06SR. In addition to the requirement of ASAP enrollment, is also informed recipients EPA's policies regarding dispersing of the funds. EPA also requires the recipients of any states to disperse funds, substantially all funds, within 5 business days. Recipients may not retain more than 5% of the amount drawn, or $1,000, whichever is less, but it must be dispersed as soon as possible, or 5 business days, in order to comply with the standard. If a draw exceeds the amount allowed, the recipient must contact RTP Finance Center for instructions on how to return those funds. Next slide. Once an account has been created, there are 4 account statuses associated with the account ID: open, liquidated, suspended, and closed. An open account status is the life of the budget period from the budget start date until the budget end date. The account status automatically updates upon expiration of the budget period to liquidated. This period is 120 days after the budget end date and allows for continuing draws of expenses incurred during the budget period. Once the liquidation expires, ASAP automatically updates the account status to suspended. At this time, the recipient will no longer be able to draw funds or have visibility of the grant. If there are funds remaining and owed to the recipient, the only way to access these funds is with the submission of a final federal financial report, or FFR. Peter will go into more details about that report later during this webinar. But for the purposes of the drawdown, once the report is received, reviewed, and prepared for financial closeout, an adjustment notice will be completed authorizing the Finance Center to reopen ASAP for a final draw. Recipient will be authorized an additional 30 days to process the final draw. Next slide. Now that we have addressed the policy and features within ASAP drawing funds, next we need to determine who can request the funds. Ryan discussed the enrollment process and roles required. At least one user within the role must be a payment requester. This person is the individual that will be requesting funds on behalf of your organization. Next slide. When making payment requests, the payment requester will log into ASAP, hover over payment request, and select Initiate Payment Request following the prompts to request a payment. As you're accessing your account, some key things to remember. You may enroll in ASAP with multiple federal agencies. You may be enrolled in ASAP with multiple federal agencies, and there may be several payment requesters assigned to the same ASAP ID. The agency location code, or ALC, designates the federal agency you have enrollments with. Be sure to select the appropriate bank account and account ID in which you wish to draw the funds. If there are any questions pertaining to your account, for example, questions pertaining to the balance, you're unable to see your account or your grant number, or there's missing site or project codes, be sure to contact the Finance Center or your servicing financial specialist for assistance. Next slide. Now that we've addressed payment requests and how to process a draw, what happens when there's a problem with the draw? For the remaining portion of my section for the webinar, I will address book entry adjustments. Next slide. The book entry adjustment feature allows payment requesters to adjust cash on hand balances between ASAP accounts that share the same agency location and the recipient without making a funding request. It works like a journal entry in a general ledger, using increases and decreases to individual accounts to reflect adjustments. Book entry adjustments are made to adjust account balances, adjust excess cash on hand, or to correct a draw made with the wrong account. It is merely an administrative correction and does not adjust the available balance in a recipient's account. Next slide. As previously mentioned, the payment requester is the individual that requests funds on behalf of the organization. This also includes your book entry adjustment. Anything involving funds, the payment requester has that role. The payment requester will again log into the ASAP account, hover over the payment request tab, select book entry adjustment. Next slide. They would then enter the agency location number and the recipient ID, also known as their ASAP ID, and click continue. Next slide. Next, is optional to enter an adjustment reference number. The adjustment reference number ideally is a code or an account ID or some type of reference that you use internally within your office. It is an optional block to select. Some recipients may do it as a payment 1 or payment 2. It's totally up to you if you want to use that feature, but it's ideally in a reference number that you can use internally within your office to keep accountability of the number of payments that you've drawn or the number of book entry adjustments that you've done. So that's an option in Block. Next, you would enter the amount. The available balance will be to decrease and increase. Next slide. ASAP gives you the option to review your requested action prior to hitting submit. So in this slide here, what's depicted is the account that was actually increased and decreased, and then you'll hit submit. And then once completed, the payment requester has the option. Next slide, please. Once completed, the payment requester has the option to print a copy of the confirmation page for the records, perform any other transaction log, or they can log out. This concludes my portion of the webinar. Next up is Peter Puglisi with the Federal Financial Reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. So we're going to discuss what happens when you have to submit interim reports and at the end of your grant when you have to close it out financially. Next slide. So we're going to discuss a little bit about the interim report, and then we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the final FFR and the requirements of that form. So the interim FFR is submitted either quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. How do you determine when to submit your interim FFR is going to be in the terms and conditions of your award, okay? The final FFR is always submitted based on the budget period end date of your award. Next slide, please. So the interim report, the regulations state that we can, as a federal agency, we cannot ask you to report more than quarterly, but we can also not ask you to report no less than annually. So the shortest term would be a quarterly report and the longest would be an annual report. Now, most of our grants are on an annual basis for your interim reporting. But like I said, you will want to check the terms and conditions of each grant to determine when you need to submit your interim FFR, okay? All FFRs, whether they're interim or final, will be submitted to the RTPFC inbox, which is that RTPFC-grants@epa.gov. Next slide. So this is the FFR. So this is used for both interim reports and for your final reports. And the top section is fairly self-explanatory. So starting there at block number 1, the agency who you're going to submit it to, what is your grant numbers, and block number 2, okay? Recipient, organization, name, address, your DUNS number, your EIN. Block 5 is optional, but if you're using a special identifier to identify your grants, it can be helpful for us if we have to call you and say we're talking to an accounting person and we give them the grant number and they say, well, no, we call that, what is our number, which might be EPA 1 or some other identifier that you use. But block 5 is optional if you want to use put your special identifier if you use one. A lot of people actually just use the EPA grant number as their identifier in their system. So block number 6 is your report type. This is important, especially for your final report. One of the things that we do get is recipients will think they're submitting a final report, but they check the annual box, right? And we're chasing the final report to close out the grant, and recipient will say, well, I already submitted that. Well, if it was marked annual, then it's not going to get processed as a final report. So just keep that in mind. When you are closing it out, just make sure it is marked as a final. And when you don't want to close it out, just make sure it's not marked as a final. If you're submitting an interim report, make sure it's marked annual, semi-annual, or quarterly. So we don't actually close it out. Now, one of the things that we do is if somebody marked annual report and the grant doesn't close out until 2020, final report, excuse me, and the grant doesn't close out until 2025, we're going to follow up with you to say, hey, do you really want to close this grant out? Because it doesn't expire for 2 or 3 years. So that's one of the checks that we try to do to ensure that we don't close something out prematurely. Block 7 is your basis of accounting. So that's up to your accounting system there. Block 8 is your project grant period. So that is going to be on page 1 of your grant award document. So you just pull that there, the from and the to. And then the reporting period end date. If this is a final report and you want to close out the grant, the reporting period end date should match the 2 there in block number 8. So it should be the same as the last day of your budget period. Okay. If it's not a final report, then the regulations are a little bit weird here. So it can be confusing here, but they want you to use the nearest quarter date. So 1/1, 3/31, 6/30, 9/30, and 12/31. So for instance, if I had an annual report that was due, and let's say my budget period ran from 8/1 to 7/31. My reporting period end date that they want for an interim report would actually be 6/30. It would be the nearest quarter, prior quarter. So since it's like 8, the grant ends on 7/31, then 6/30 would be the nearest quarter that passed. Okay, it's a little odd there, but they don't want you on a interim report. They don't want you to actually report on the grant period. They want you to report on a quarter. So it can be a little confusing there, but just keep in mind that, if your grant doesn't end on a quarter, which a lot of our grants do, they end on 9/30 or 6/30. So, you're using that quarterly date anyways, but if it doesn't, just go backwards to the nearest quarter. So if I'm on 12/1, then I want to use 9/30, right? If I'm on, 1/26, then I want to use 12/31, right? The nearest quarter. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into the meat of this form and the importance of the form. And there are some really key distinctions when we're looking at the different sections here in the form. So if we start on 10 A, B, and C, this is your federal cash report. One of the keys here is that this section is only used for interim reports. When you're doing a final report, you do not fill out 10 A, B, or C. It is not required. Will we reject your form and send it back if you do fill it out? No, unless it's completely has weird numbers or something on it. But you do not have to do it. So don't fret over 10 A, B, or C when you are going to close out your grant. It is only required on the interim reports. So 10A is your cash receipts. The government defines this as your drawdowns. So how much money did you draw down during that period? How much money did you disperse? So how much did you spend? Okay, those two numbers can be different. They don't have to be the same. And then cash on hand is the difference between what you drew down and what you spent. So for instance, if I drew down $100,000, but we actually spent $150,000, then my cash on hand would be negative $50,000. Now what that tells the government is that we actually owe you $50,000. There's $50,000 in expenses that you have not drawn down yet. Conversely, if your cash receipts or your drawdowns $150,000 and your disbursements is only $100,000, that tells us that you're holding on to federal funds. And technically, you are violating the EPA policy there that was talked about earlier about holding on to money and needing to liquidate your funding. So the maximum, of course, cash on hand that you can have is $1,000, right? A 5% of your draw with a maximum amount of $1,000. Even that $1,000 you have in your bank account, that you need to liquidate that as soon as possible. So this cash on hand portion of the interim report really gives the government an indication of, are you drawing properly? Are you holding on to federal funds? Or are you not drawing properly, which would be, you know, I have cash receipts of 0, but I have expenses of $100,000. And it's like, well, why aren't you drawing that money down? Because for the federal government, we don't want you to be holding on to our money, but we also don't want you to be spending all of your money and not drawing down your grant funds. That's not good either. So we want things to be as close as possible, close as humanly possible. And the good thing is that ASAP system that they talked about earlier, you're going to get your money the same day, depending on how you drew it, or at the latest the next business day. So this isn't the olden days of the government where you maybe submit an invoice and it takes 30 days to get your money and therefore you need to draw more to cover expenses and things like that. The way it works now is it's really like online banking. It's very simple to do a drawdown and you get your money same day or next business day at the latest. So that's why the government doesn't want you to have cash on hand. They don't want you to be holding our money because you could just draw as you need it, okay? So the next section is the federal expenditures, D through H. And there's a key distinction between the cash and the expenditures here. Because the cash asked you, federal cash asks you what your drawdowns are under cash receipts. This next section doesn't ever ask you what your drawdowns are. And it's an important distinction because some people, when they go in to close out their grant, they put their drawdowns in here, but this doesn't ask you anything about your draws. So let's look at this section. Section D, federal funds authorized. That is the amount, the total amount of your grant award. So if you had 2 or 3 amendments and each amendment was for $10,000, then your federal funds authorized is $30,000. Let's say you had 3 for $10,000 each. That's going to be the total amount that you have received from the inception of the grant to today when you're closing out the award. And you can see line E asks you about expenditures. It doesn't ask you about your drawdowns. It asks you how much money did you spend? Whether you drew the money or you didn't draw the money, how much did you spend here? Line F is federal share of unliquidated obligations. So that's things that you've committed for but haven't paid for yet. Now, when you go to close out your grant, you cannot have unliquidated obligations. And the reason is this: you've committed to something, but you haven't paid for it yet. You cannot have expenses beyond the end of your budget period. And that's why you can't have unliquidated obligations, because you haven't paid for something yet, but your budget period has ended, right? So on an interim report, you can have unliquidated obligations, right? Because your grant is ongoing, and you can pay for things next month or 6 months from now. When you close out a grant, there's no more time to pay for things. So just keep in mind, when you're doing a closeout, line F should always be 0. You cannot have unliquidated obligations. So line G is the total federal share. So that's just the sum there. And then line H is unobligated balance of federal funds. So that's what's left over. So to kind of easily encapsulate this section, I just say, this is what you gave me, this is what we spent, and this is what we're not going to use. And that's referring to a closeout. We're focusing really on a closeout right now, but so unobligated balance is money that we're not going to use. And when you check final on that report, keep in mind that, and you list an unobligated balance of federal funds, you're authorizing us to take that money off the award and it's going to go away. So that's the importance of doing these reports, is ensuring, one, that you're not checking final when it's not final, because it could trigger us to remove funds from the award. And then the second component is to make sure that you have captured all of your expenses, because if there is an expense that's not included on line G on your total federal share, and you have an unobligated balance that you want deobligated from the award, we're gonna process it, and we're gonna take that money off the award. But I will tell you this, you know, if you do find that there were some expenses, and this happens from time to time, for instance, someone submits a final FFR today, and they have an unobligated balance of $5,000. Let's just keep it simple. And then 2 weeks later, somebody says, oh, we forgot that we paid this company $2,500 for something that, you know, on the grant that occurred during the budget period. You can revise this report and resubmit it to include those expenses. So don't fret if you do make a mistake. The key is, you know, let's just revise it, and then we will issue you an additional payment. We can get that money paid out. So as long as it was incurred during the budget period, so that's the key. So it makes it an eligible expense for the award. You can revise these FFRs. And they actually go both ways, because we've had recipients come back and say, oh, this vendor issued me a refund of $100 on the award, so I need to send $100 back to the EPA. How do I do that? Well, you do a revised FFR, and it'll show an unobligated balance will increase by $100, and it'll show us that you owe us $100, okay? So that's your expenditures section. Now we're going to get into the recipient share here. So not all awards have a recipient share. The grant itself is going to outline what your recipient share is, not only on page 1 as a percentage of the expenses, but also on page 2 there, and also in your budget area on page 3. So the recipient share is going to be based off of the percentage. So if you didn't spend 100% of the grant money, because there's a percentage listed on your award, and then there's a raw dollar amount on page 2 in the top section there that is based off of what that percentage is. So for instance, if we'll make it simple, we have $100,000 award, and there's a 20% cost share, then that means it's $80,000 will be federal and $20,000 will be for the recipient share. If you spend all $80,000 of the grant award, then you're required to provide $20,000 of recipient share, and that's what would be reported in this section here. If you don't spend $80,000, let's say you spent less, then you're going to only be required to cost share 20% in this instance of total cost. So this is an important factor here that we have to consider, because it's not 20% of the federal amount. It's 20% of the total amount of the award. Okay. So recipients do get tripped up in this section, and they think, you know, well, I only have to cost share 20% of whatever I spent on the federal side, but that's not true. You have to, it's based on the total amount of the award. So it ends up being, you know, a different number than that. So this is where you're going to report your recipient share here. And the last section here on the form is the program income. So you are allowed to earn program income per the regulations, and the EPA's preferred method is the addition method, which is line N. Okay, so your federal, if you do have program income, so, well, let me just step back and just say, you know, program income is money that is earned with the grant funds. It is not your drawdowns, because people do get that confused, because, you know, in accounting parlance, Some people think of income as their drawdowns, but it is not your drawdowns. It would be money above and beyond that you earned via the grant. So how could I earn money with the grant? Let's say you put on a conference with grant funds and you charge $10 for people to attend your conference. That $10 is program income. And according to the regulations, EPA's preferred method is line N, which is expended in accordance with the addition alternative. So if you have a $100,000 grant and you earn $5,000 in program income, you now have a $105,000 grant. You know, you're going to use that for the grant program. If you didn't use it, you would report any unexpended program income there on line O. Next slide, please. If you are approved for indirect expenses in your grant, so in your budget, you need to be approved for indirect expenses to charge indirect expenses. And if you are, you would report that here on line 11. And line 12 would be any additional information that you have. And then, of course, the end here, which is the signature, your certifying official, whoever you authorize to sign Ffrs at your organization would sign it and provide the telephone, email address, and a date here. And some of the important things here is that whoever's number you list here or email address you list here is the person we're going to be contacting if there's an issue with this award. So just keep that in mind. Make sure, you know, you can have a high level person signing, but you can list the email address of the accountant that handles these reports. So that way we'll contact that person. But just make sure that, you know, whoever is listed here is someone we can contact, because if there's ever an issue with this report, this is the person that we're going to go and reach out to. Next slide, please. So the closeout requirements. I know that we have a lot of new recipients on the line, but I know we have existing recipients on the line too. So just let me say, currently, if you have a grant that was awarded before November of 2020, that grant may have a different closeout requirement. So currently the closeout requirement is 120 days from the end of your budget period end date. That rule was changed in November 2020. So prior to November 2020, the requirement was 90 days. So if you have an older grant that you still have out there, just check the terms and conditions of the award, because that's really going to dictate it. If you have a grant prior to 2020, it probably is 90 days, but you want to check the terms and conditions. If you have a grant that was awarded after November 2020, it's 120 days. So you have 120 days from that date to submit your report, complete your draws, and do everything that you need to do to close out the award. So in ASAP, once a grant hits 120 days, or if it's an older grant, it will be 91 days on the 91st day or the 121st day. The grant is going to be automatically suspended in ASAP, and you're not going to be able to draw on that grant until you submit your final FFR. Okay. So there's three statuses in ASAP that we haven't talked about. One is open, and that's the status that happens when your budget period is active. So those dates within your budget period, your grant's going to be open in ASAP. Once you pass the end of your budget period, it's going to go to what's called liquidated status. Liquidated means you can draw your money. So a lot of people say, well, I can't draw my money, it's in liquidated. No, you can. It's just telling you that you're in that 120-day period. So it changes the status automatically just to inform you that, hey, you need to make your final draws and get this thing done. And then on the 121st day, it's going to go to suspended, and you will not be able to access that money until you submit the final FFR to the EPA. One of the keys too is remember to include all the costs from the inception of the grant. So if you have amendments, we want a consolidated report with all of your expenses and costs that you have incurred. Next slide, please. So what are the common mistakes? Is the cost share, is either not reporting it, under-reporting it, making a mistake on the cost share. That's probably one of our biggest reasons that we reject and send FFRs back is because of the cost share. Another one is it's not marked final. So we talked about that earlier, getting in that scenario where I submitted my report and to us, we say, you didn't submit your report, you submitted an annual report. So just keep that in mind. Your dates. So we're talking about your budget period dates being incorrect on the top. So always go to your last amendment if you're not sure what your budget period dates are, because if your grant has been extended, then that last amendment is going to give you the actual final date on there. And then not signed. So just make sure that it's signed. We do accept a certified digital signature. We don't accept just a cursive kind of signature that just gets slapped in there. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So what is our role in the closeouts? So we receive all of the closeout, all of the FFRs, whether it's an interim report or if it's a final report. Everything is going to be sent to us to that email address we've talked about a couple times. So if it's an interim report, we're posting it into our internal system where our project officers and our grant specialists can have access and look at that report and determine, audit it and see what's going on with the grant. When it's a final report, that's when we come into play. So we're going to audit that final FFR. We're going to look and compare what you're reporting as your expenditures versus what our system has as the money that you've drawn down. And we're going to look and see if there's a difference there. If there's a difference there, then we're going to notify you one of two ways. So for instance, if we look at our accounting system and it says you've drawn $90,000 and your FFR says you've spent $100,000, we're going to notify you that please go in and make that final draw of $10,000. The same way on the converse is if your FFR says you spent $90,000, but our accounting system shows you've drawn $100,000, we're going to go ahead and set up an accounts receivable and ask you to return those funds to the EPA. So we're responsible for the financial closeout of the award, just as we're responsible for the payments and the obligations. And we kind of take your grant from birth to death financially. And then our other partners, the grants and the program offices, assist to completely close out the grant award. But this is our little piece of the action. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cassandra Green, who is going to talk about that accounts receivable and how to return funds to EPA, whether it's at the end of the award and you're trying to close it out, or if you need to, if you overdrew during the life of the award and you need to return it as the grant is active. Cassandra?
Thank you, Wayne. Yes, my portion of the presentation will be regarding the return of funds. Primarily, I'm going to be speaking to funds that need to be returned at the end of the budget period. The method that is utilized to return funds, if you had a draw within the last 32 days, then you can return it via ASAP. But if it's past that period, the funds need to be returned in one of two ways. And the agency's preferred and recommended method is to return the funds via a Treasury system called pay.gov. This system is operated by the Treasury Department, and it's utilized by the U.S. federal government agencies. And as I stated, it is the preferred and recommended method for the EPA. The system is free. It's a secure portal for payments to all federal agencies. It's a web-based system. There isn't a sign-in account requirement, and it's available 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So, next slide. Okay, next slide. So, we do this one of two ways. Once your final FFR has been reconciled by the grants branch, and if it's found that your agency owes the EPA funds, and as as Peter stated, an accounts receivable request will come to my department, and what we will do is we will generate a bill within pay.gov. Also, at that time, an access code will be created and generated by us. The access code, along with the e-bill, will be sent to the recipient's primary point of contact. The primary point of contact receives the email notification along with the access code and instructions on how to view and pay the bill within pay.gov. And the snapshot there is a snapshot of what the email would look like from pay.gov to you. This slide here shows another method to utilize pay.gov. If, for an example, you have completed your final FFR and you know that you owe the agency, let's say $1,000, you can utilize this link that's on the slide to just go in and actually just make the payment at that time without waiting for the EPA to send you an e-bill. This link is an account for the RTP Finance Center, and we will receive those funds via this link. Next slide. Actually, go back to the previous slide. This is an example. I'm sorry. Nope. Flip one. Yeah, right there. Thanks. This is an example of what that form would look like if you utilize the link to make the payment. One of the things that we like to make sure that everyone knows, whenever you are making a payment, whether it be through pay.gov or if you're making a check payment, please make sure that you include the grant number. If you have received a bill, there's a bill number that would be attached to that particular bill, and that information needs to be on whatever means that you are returning the money to the EPA. That allows us to immediately know what grant the funds need to be applied to. Next slide. So if you are utilizing pay.gov, which like I said, this is the referred and recommended method by the EPA, there are two accepted payment methods for the RTP Finance Center. One is an ACH debit, which utilizes your banking information to make the payment. Also, you can use PayPal. If you are unable to use those two methods, there are other methods to make payments to the EPA. One of them is FedWire, and there's a couple other ones. But like I said, the preferred method is pay.gov. Next slide. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about other things that you need to know if you are returning funds to the agency, or if you actually have a debt to the agency. So the receivables or any debts must be refunded within 30 days of the initial bill. Any funds that are not returned within 30 days will begin to accrue interest, admin fees, penalty charges. If you are a state or a local or a tribal government, you are exempt from admin and penalty charges. Debts that are not repaid within 120 days will be referred to the U.S. Treasury Department for collection activities. So it's very important that you return the funds as soon as possible, preferably within 30 days. And that way, no interest or any other charges will be assessed against that debt. And I believe that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so just to end the presentation off before we start the question and answer section, here's some contact info. You folks might want to jot these numbers down. If you have any questions related to ASAP that we didn't cover, you can always reach out to us at RTPFC. That is the grant's email inbox that you can reach us at. Your email will go to the inbox, and depending upon what region your grant is assigned to, it'll get sent to a financial specialist for review and to help you through whatever questions you have. And if you have any questions related specifically to ASAP, that's the ASAP help desk number. Very good resource. As I mentioned before in my presentation, ASAP is a treasury system. So there are some things that as a federal agency, as your enrollment initiator, we can help you with at the EPA, but there are some issues that are ASAP related that you would want to reach out to the ASAP help desk. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach us at rtpfc-grants@epa.gov. Okay. And the questions, any questions?
Thank you, Ryan. So I have a question in the inbox says, and this is pertaining to your federal financial report. So Ryan, if you can go back to that slide. It's like slide 31. The next slide, please. Thank you. So as it pertains to the federal financial report in section 10D, the award amount that will be received by the closeout date, 1.6 mil, or the amount to date you are allowed to draw. So is in 10D, the award amount that will be received by the closeout date, 1.6 mil, I'm assuming that's an example, or the amount to date you're allowed to draw. Example 100K partial draw. Peter, you want to take that question?
Well, 10D is going to be the total amount of funds that you have received from, or you have been awarded for the life of the entire grant. So if you got a $1.6 million grant, then you want to put 1.6 million on 10D.
Okay, thank you. Next question, on interim FFRs for awards with multi-year project and budget periods, are sections 10A, B, and C cumulative, including draws from prior reporting years to date, or only the reporting period for that year?
It's cumulative. So if you're in the second year of an award, then you will include expenses from the first day of the budget period all the way to that reporting period end date.
Okay, Next question. If you were drawing down indirect funds in a grant period using a provisional indirect rate, close the grant and then receive the final indirect rate, which resulted in you having to draw down more indirect than was allowed with the final rate, how do you pay back the overdrawn funds? It sounds like you would amend the final FFR and pay the difference back via pay.gov.
Yes.
And do we need to do more elaboration on section 10D? We have a response to that they've never reported it that way.
Yeah, if they could flesh it out a little bit more, because I'm kind of confused about the amount to date that you're allowed to draw 100K partial. We actually don't have a limit on, we don't limit the amount of funds that you can draw down to a particular dollar amount. If you expended 200,000, then you draw 200,000. So I'm a little confused on the question. If maybe you could provide some more background.
So while we're waiting on feedback from that attendee, I'm going to go over into some of the questions that we have published already, just to kind of elaborate on some of those questions. So one of the questions we have is if the award is 100,000 with 10% cost share and you have 20,000 program income, does the cost share need to change to match the new grant amount of 120K?
Well, I had answered that in the chat, Charlie. So your cost share is based on your federal expenditures. It looks like the person had said they get partial awards. Do you mean an annual award? I think we still need to flesh it out a little bit more. EPA does, issue partial awards where you're funded every year if the money is available, if possible.
This is Julie Malazza. There might be, I think I might understand this question. So in some cases, we might say we're approving a budget for this amount, but we only have this amount to give you right now. So we'll give you the rest, later. So it does show up in the budget as the full amount, but they've only received a portion of that.
Yeah, you're going to report based on what you receive, because, for instance, the 1.6 million is not guaranteed. It's based on funding, and if you only got $100,000 of that 1.6 million and EPA ran out of money, then your grant's $100,000. So really the important piece of your when you're doing your reporting is page 2 of your award, not page 1. So page 2 is going to say what is your total amount to date. So I kind of trying to go off memory. I think it's former award, this action, and then total amount. Does that sound right? But page 2 is that's what all your financial reporting is based on. It's not based on what you could have got. It's only based on the actual amount of money that you have received. So you would focus that on page 2, not on the page 1. Yes, I mean, you don't want to use, ASAP as your reporting, kind of a basis per se, but yes, I mean, currently what's in ASAP should be what your award amount is. But yeah, whatever's on page 2 of your grant award is, the key. That's the money that you received, and that's been awarded to you, and that's what all your financial reporting should be based off of.
Charlene, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So it looks like we've responded to all the questions that came through chat. Are there any additional questions that you have?
There is a question that says, could you give us the formula for calculating the cost share amount? So the formula is basically your federal share plus your recipient share is going to be the total amount of expenses on the award. If your grant, then you would hit that against the percentage outlined on your grant award. So for instance, to keep it simple, again, you have a 20% cost share, and 80,000 is federal, 80,000 federal plus 20,000 recipient equals 100,000, times 20% is going to be, 20,000. So that's how you're going to determine it if you met your cost share is based off of that formula. Now, maybe I'm not answering it exactly as you want. So if you want, you can kind of email me. We can flesh something out with better numbers. But that's essentially the formula. So you have three components. If you don't know one of those components, then you kind of have to do algebra. But it's your federal share plus your recipient share is your total cost for the award. And then that's the percentage on the award is going to determine, did you meet the cost share by calculating that percentage against your total cost on the award.
Okay, there's a question in here about, and I imagine they're talking about the book entry adjustment. I do journal entries for an overdraw of an award. Take from one and return to another equals 0. I didn't see that you covered that. So that was covered under the book entry adjustment when you need to make a correction to an award for payment that might have been drawn from the wrong award. And that discussed the increase decrease under the book entry adjustment section of this presentation. So another question, Grantee asks, how do you calculate the cost share amount? So there's another question on cost share, Peter.
What was the question again? I'm sorry, I was reading another one.
Another calculation question with regards to the cost share.
Oh, how do you calculate the cost share amount? I'm assuming it's if you didn't spend all the money, right? Is that if you didn't spend all the federal share and you're not sure what your cost share is, or is that a general question of how does EPA come up with a cost share amount? So if maybe you could, are you looking for how does EPA determine what the cost share should be at the inception of the grant, or is that, are we at the end of the grant and you're trying to figure out how to close it out and make sure you met your cost share? Question could go in two different directions.
So if that attendee will elaborate more on their question with regards to the cost share, we can answer that question for you. So Jenny Russell says the answer stumps me. This is pertaining to the response you gave for 10D. I thought D was to correlate to page 3 of the award, table A, line 12.
I'm looking at a grant, it's line 12. Let's see. And that kind of goes back into, I believe it goes back into that original question of, if you're getting incrementally funded, because as I understood that's based off of line D on page 3 is based off of incremental funding, whether you the total amount, whether you receive the money or not. That's the total budget cost that you applied for, and you don't want to use that number if you haven't received that money, because that's a different amount of money than what is on the award document, what's in the accounting system, and things like that. So that's why the amended total on page 2 is really what you want to base your reporting off of. You don't want to base your reporting off of funds that you could receive next year or you may never receive because EPA no longer funds the program or doesn't, or the budget changes or something like that. So it looks like you're from a state, so you probably do get the money that you probably haven't maybe been in the situation where you didn't get fully funded for the money that they, applied for up front. But you do want to base it off of your amended total on page 2, because that's actually the amount of funds that have been awarded in the accounting system. So if it's different than what's on page 3, because you didn't end up receiving all the funds, then obviously there would be a problem with the closeout. So if you look at page 3, line 15, it says total EPA amount awarded to date. And that, if you receive all the money that, was initially applied for up front, then that number is going to match line 12. But if you didn't, then they're going to have two different numbers. So that's why it's kind of best to, base your reporting on page 2 amended total, or you can do page 3, line 15, total EP amount awarded to date. But if you use 12 and you ended up not getting all the funds that you had applied for, then it's not going to match our accounting records and we're going to send the FFR back to you.
Ryan, if you could go to slide 24.
Okay, just let me know to go forward and back because I can't see the. Okay, let's see. That slide right there, Charlene.
To the next slide, steps 3 or 4. So this is in response to the inquiry in regards to the book entry adjustments and the journal entries. So this was the section of the slide presentation that discussed book entry adjustments and how to do such for your journal entries. So if there was an issue with a payment and you drew from the wrong account, you would do a book entry adjustment, do a decrease, increase according to whichever account that you're trying to transfer the money between. Again, this is an administrative correction to a payment that was incorrectly drawn. So hopefully that answers that question with regards to the book entry adjustment. And again, a copy of this presentation will be provided. But if there are specific questions that you need to know about the book entry adjustment, please drop it in the chat for us.
Okay, so somebody says, how do you calculate the 20% cost share to $150,000 of federal expenses? I imagine, right? Federal expenditures. So you have to go back to like algebra class, unfortunately. So you have to, the formula that I would do would be that $150,000 equals 80% of X, right? So 80% of the grant is equal to $150,000. Okay. So then I would divide 150,000 by 0.8, and that would give me the total amount of the grant, or the total amount that would be recipient plus federal, which would be 187,500. Then I would subtract the federal part of 150,000. So that would tell me 150,000 is federal, 37,500 is recipient, to be an 80-20 split. And let me know if I did that way too fast. I'm sorry if I did. Because you just have to plug in what you know, right? We know if 150,000 is federal, we know that's equal to 80% of the total cost of the award. So when I do the division, it gives me the total cost of the award as 137,500. I mean 187,500. Excuse me. I could either multiply that by 20%, and that would give me 37,500, or I can just subtract the federal share of 150,000 from 187,500, and that gives me 37,500 as my recipient share. So you have to kind of do an algebraic equation because you can't take 20% of the federal share. It's 20% of the total grant amount. That is the calculation for the cost share. So that's why I had to figure out what was the total amount of the award of the all expenses, federal plus recipient, before I could hit it or multiply it by 20%.
Okay, hopefully that explains that question. So they're coming out with a 1% different from the Fed calculator.
If you're not, how about this? If you're not sure, you can always contact us. Because that's kind of what I came up with based off of 150,000 in federal expenses. It hit at 20% on the dot. So if you had, first of all, yeah, that's a good question. If you ever have a question, you're filling out these FFRs, always contact us. We have currently EPA split into 10 regions, and then we have headquarters, which we call it, the 11th region sometimes, right? 11 regions that award funds. In the Finance Center, we currently have 9 financial specialists, or 10 financial specialists, excuse me. One specialist has 2 regions, but we are hiring folks. So there pretty much is one individual that you can rely on as a financial specialist to assist you with filling out any of these reports, doing drawdowns, doing a book entry adjustment, just about anything. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you have a question, whether it's about cost share, whether it's about how to draw your funds down, enrolling in ASAP. I mean, all the things that we've talked about today are things that we're responsible for and we can assist you with. So that's our main email address. You can send any questions you have there. All your reports will go there. That's kind of our main communication portal for recipients. That's worked daily and is kept up to date on a daily basis. So it's not something that just sits there and nobody's monitoring that email box. Okay, so someone says, we're going to start off by knowing how much our project costs. Yeah, so, it's a basic formula, and if you, depending on what information you have is really how you're going to determine what it was. So starting with the federal, that's how we start with the federal expenditures, right? If we only knew the federal expenditures, that's why I did the mathematical formula that way. But yes, I mean, the easiest way is to be all your total expenses multiplied by that requirement, and that will give you the recipient share, and the difference would be, obviously the federal share. So 80% would be federal, 20% would be recipient.
So we did not cover this question here, but who is your SAM.gov specialist?
SAM.gov is a treasury system. And, we really don't have any authority or anything over SAM.gov. So to really get assisted with any SAM.gov problems, you really need to go through SAM.gov through the U.S. Treasury because we really have no ability to do anything in SAM.gov. Every specialist has a base knowledge of SAM.gov if you have questions, but if you really need an action done, we can't assist you, unfortunately, because it's not our system. Same thing goes with ASAP. Ryan talked about the roles and responsibilities of ASAP. ASAP is a U.S. Treasury system. There's certain things that we do in ASAP, and there's certain things we cannot do in ASAP. So for instance, we can change your budget period end dates. So if you get an extension on your award and you go into ASAP, and you can't find your award, it's disappeared, because when your grant goes into suspended status, it kind of disappears. You won't be able to see it on your account anymore. That's where you would call your EPA financial specialist or send an email to the inbox to say, my grant is no longer in ASAP. What happened? I can't access it. And I got a budget period extension. It's not showing up. So we initiate the enrollment like this slide says, but ASAP actually completes it. You know, we do that initial initiation. And one of the keys is if you've been enrolled with another agency and you have an account with another agency, we still have to enroll you. That's a key point. We still have to enroll you. Every agency that you do business with has to enroll you in ASAP. Is the process simple? Yes. You skip all the steps. You know, you go right to the end step. You don't have to go through all the process when you're already enrolled, but we do have to initiate that enrollment. Once we initiate, ASAP takes it over. So we create the accounts like this slide says. We do increases and decreases of funds. So if you do get an incremental award and it's not showing up in ASAP for some reason, contact us. That's something that we can look at. But if you're having a user ID or password issue, that's not something that we can do. If you need to change your users, if you want to add somebody to be able to do drawdowns in the system, it's not something that we can do. That's something that Treasury has to do. So Treasury is very good at their customer service is good at the ASAP help desk, and they are good at walking people through draws. We have a little bit harder time doing it just because we can't see the screens that you see. So that's one of the things is we're a user of ASAP, but we're an agency user. So when we go into ASAP and we can't see the drop downs don't work for us. Some of them don't work for us because they're recipient drop downs. Just like when you go into ASAP, you can't use the agency side of it. So we have a little bit of a hard time walking somebody through a draw because we can't look at the screens, right? I mean, we can assist you with that, and we will, but ASAP Help Desk is more of an expert on that, and they can assist you with that. But yeah, so that last kind of bit there, the walk users through draws, book entry adjustments, we can assist you too with that. ASAP is better than us because that's their system, and they're able to get in the background of that system, and we can't. But we can also assist you with that stuff too. So. If we can't help you, we'll get somebody from ASAP to help you. It's not a problem.
So we have a question. We are a current ASAP recipient, but what would be the process of adding another person to our ASAP account that would allow them to request draws?
Yeah, you'll have to go through the ASAP help desk. They have a phone number and they also have an email that you can, contact them, but they'll get the person added to your account. They're the ones that have to do that. I don't know, do we have the ASAP email on there?
We've got the help desk phone number in here, and that's a good place to start. It's because they can actually, like you were saying, Peter, actually walk you through the individual steps as you're doing it in the menu options.
Okay, here's a question again about SAM. We cannot register for SAMs because the system is not allowing us to register. It transposed the name of the organization, so it does not work. We cannot speak to a live person. The agents of no help. Who can I turn to at SAMS.gov? Do you have a phone number or a live person in their IT department?
Yeah, this is a real problem we've been having too. We don't have any pull with SAM.gov. I'm just going to be completely honest with you, because we've recently tried to push something through SAM.gov and we had the same problem. I hate to give you this answer, but it is a problem that we're having. If you want to send us an email to the RTPFC grants, we'll try to see. We want to try to help you as much as possible. So we'll try to think of another avenue, but we're having trouble with SAM.gov also. And that's just an honest answer.
And this is Julie Milazzo. If you want to include me in those emails from RTPFC, so grantees, feel free to just email RTPFC directly, but then RTPFC, if you want to include me, and we can see if there's anyone in my office who might have some experience with this as well.
Yeah, I know that SAM is having some technical difficulties. I think they were down last month for a period of time. Charlene knows better. Or 2 months ago, the end of March into April. Is that right, Charlene? So they've been having their own problems. Some real issues going on over there that, you know, we're dealing with the same issues.
Yeah.
Any additional questions?
Did the one about ASAP and adding an additional person, did that one get answered?
Yes.
Oh, it did. Okay. Okay.
Yes, we referred them to the ASAP desk, help desk.
Great. Thank you.
Do you see any other ones that we may have missed? I think we got them all.
Yeah, you guys answered a ton of questions.
And I'll just add too, for ASAP, for new users, if you play around in the menus, ASAP has a lot of training aids that are actually in their menus for new users. As Peter mentioned, we're of course here to help. The ASAP help desk is there also, but ASAP does have already built into their system, in their drop-down boxes, they do have training aids for new users. So if you've got somebody that's going to be payment requester, you've got somebody that's in a new role and they have some questions about their new roles, ASAP has those training aids already available in their system after you log in their drop-down menus for you to give new employees or people who are in new roles.
Okay, I think that we have covered all of the questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to Emma.
Sure. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. As we've noted, the recording of the webinar and this presentation will be posted on the EPA website in the coming weeks, and that link is in the chat. And of course, as you can see on the screen here as well, is the RTPFC email address if you have any more specific questions. We will compile the questions that were asked today into an FAQ, which will be posted on the EPA website as well for your reference. Thank you, everyone.